Hello and welcome. I'm Tommaso Eridani, and this is Story Scanner, the podcast based on the stories in Via Sarfatti 25, the magazine from Bocconi, with insights and articles from Bocconi professors on the big topics in management, business, politics and data science. Today, we're looking ahead to 2023, and especially some of the big trends that will be impacting on the lives of the younger generations. Just a few days ago, The Economist, in its issue looking ahead to 2023, wrote that, in retrospect, the pandemic marked the end of a period of relative stability and predictability in geopolitics and economics. Today's world is much more unstable and unpredictable is the new normal. Fact, not yet out of the pandemic and still feeling the aftershocks, 2022 was convulsed by the war in Ukraine. And wider society today is experiencing a series of megatrends which are bringing slow but persistent change. Megatrends which range from climate change to demographic trends like the aging population, and which are accelerated by shocks such as pandemics, war, financial crisis and geopolitical upheavals. And this uncertainty impacts strongly on the ability to make decisions on the future, especially for younger generations and their choices. To discuss all this, today I'm joined by Francesco Billari, Rector of Bocconi University, and three students from the Bocconi Media Center.
I'm Matteo Pozzi for Radio Bocconi.
I'm Matilde Jorio for Bocconi TV.
I'm Bojan Zeric for Leoni.
Thanks to everyone for joining in. So, Professor Billari, what 2023 awaits us? Another year of shocks and unpredictability, or are there some certainties we can hinge on to?
I could say both. First of all, it was not really true that before the pandemic the world was predictable and sort of smooth. If we take a global perspective, shocks and vulnerability have been there all over the world also before the pandemic. So the idea that there were certainties and smoothness is a sort of biased idea from the rich world perspective. So we will have to get used to shocks. That's something that entails the type of life we are living today, but also what we have lived in the past. On the other hand, I like to say that we'll bring some positives to 2023. I'm thinking of the attention towards sustainability. This will stay and will bring a better world, hopefully, but this will be something that I don't think will be discarded. The second aspect will be the attention to diversity and inclusion. I think this is something we won't go back in terms of progress. We will keep the advantage we have developed. A third aspect is something I'm a bit more hopeful, and it's more related to where we are now. It's Europe. I think there's been a crisis on some parts of Europe. On the other hand, the pandemic has shown that Europe can answer. Vaccine deployment at the EU level has been fundamentally well done. And so this is something we may bring forward to 2023. A fourth aspect I'd like to mention is the positive consequences of digitalization. I think this is going to stay.
So, Professor, would you say that rather than bring poorer countries, or as you mentioned, other parts of the world where uncertainty has always been an issue, instead of bringing them closer to the Western way of life, we need to accept the uncertainty that those countries have been living with? And in that case, what do you think we need to do with respect to our lifestyle and our way of thinking? Because from what we see, there's in the richer part of the world, I would say there's a striving for certainty and avoiding unpredictable events. So how can we deal with that?
Oh, thank you. This is a very important issue, Matteo. I believe that we have to grasp this idea from an inequality perspective. And inequality should not be only focused on specific parts of the world. within country, within the EU, but we have to take a global perspective. So if the certainty in some part of the world has to be at the cost of uncertainty in another part of the world, that's not going to be sustainable. And I think in some of the recent decades, we have grown in certainty and well-being in some parts of the world, but we have not considered the fact that in other parts of the world there's been a growth in well-being. So the world has improved in general, but the risks are there all over the world. So what we need to come about is an idea in which we share resilience to shocks at a more global level. And again, the pandemic is not only a situation in which we have witnessed a big crisis with negative health consequences. We have also witnessed solidarity at the international level, and I think this is a potential starting point. We need more of that.
Professor, do you think that there is a widespread awareness of this inequality that remains from a global level, as you said? And if there isn't, where do you think we can start in providing this kind of awareness?
Yeah, Bojan, I think, let's say, as a social scientist, it's also our duty to make the world aware of the real data. I don't think there is a big awareness of the fact that poverty has decreased at the global level. So it's true that there may be more inequality if we look at the top of the distribution. On the other hand, progress has spread all over the world, and there are fewer people dying with hunger or fewer people in poverty. We have more people in relative poverty in some parts of the world. So the awareness is twofold. First, we have to look at the data and popularize that. And second, understand that there may be a difference between the relative way of thinking we can have in a specific society, like Italy, Europe, any country you take, and a global perspective where we may think about the progress done in the poorest part of the world.
Pardon me, Professor. Given that the younger generations are more and more trying to gain a role in discussion about these specific topics, mainly sustainability, fighting social injustice, inequality, fighting inequalities as well, how could they undertake with a sensible and impactful activism these specific topics? And would the university be a favorable channel to do so?
I think so, Matilde. I think before becoming active, you need to study a bit. I know maybe it's a conflict of interest, but I also think that this should start before university. So if you are interested in fighting climate change or kind of thinking that societies become more resilient to and adapted to climate change, you need to study climate change before. So universities are crucial because they provide access to science, research, knowledge, and data. In particular, if I think about Bocconi, what you as students could do is to learn a lot how the world works in terms of data. I love a website called Our World in Data. I will say before thinking about anything that any social issue that you like to address, first look at the data. Then look at the science, because data is about describing and discovering the world, and science, including social science, can tell us how to answer to world's challenge. And then you can do some more kind of reality and fact-aware activism. So you can have your own choices, your own political views, but they have to be based on evidence.
On a related note, how do you not get overwhelmed by all the data that is around? Because when I'm studying some social issue, something also for university, oftentimes I find that there's so much data and data sets on this or that issue that it's really hard to decide what to pick. So what's a good rule of thumb to maybe also for people that didn't specifically study data science, how to orient themselves in this world?
Yeah, I don't think you need to study data science to be able to grasp what are the important sources of data. Maybe this is also our mission as professors, to understand that there is a hierarchy in terms of quality of data and in terms of relevance. So you need first to understand that some scientific standards are the gold standards. For instance, distinguish sample surveys from marketing surveys that are based on quotas. Distinguish scientific approaches to data collection from something that is done for other purpose, like journalism, where we consult the audience to a specific TV show. This is not kind of understanding about the world. So this is our mission, to try and help you in learning what is gold standard evidence and what is of a less kind of a lower level. I'm not saying that the lower level is not important evidence, but if you have a choice, try to go for the gold standard.
So, Matteo, we were discussing earlier about demographic trends. I think you had a interesting
So first of all, I didn't say this before because I didn't want to interrupt, but first I want to say that it's truly a pleasure to be here. And Tommaso said before the beginning that it's the first time that we get to do something like this with students and the rector sitting at a table. So really thank you on behalf of Radio Bocconi and also Bocconi TV and Tra i Leoni.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. So when I was invited to participate, I looked into your career and I saw that you specialize in demography, correct?
Correct, yeah. I started as a normal Bocconi student and I became a demographer.
So talking about uncertainty and what to expect, an issue that I think most people interested in the social sciences really have dear at heart is the negative demographic trends that are characterizing many rich countries, and I would say especially Italy. I read an article on Corriere della Sera the other day that said that by 2070, the Italian GDP is expected to drop by almost 30% because of the brain drain that is occurring in Italy. So based on your experience and your research, I would ask you if you can give us some insight on these demographic trends and what, especially as younger generations, what can we do to impact them, prevent them from getting worse and potentially reversing them even?
Yeah, thank you. The point is that there are different, again, divergent demographic trends in different parts of the world. You have some parts of the world in which there is a quick growth with a very young population, and most of Europe, but in particular places like Italy, where the population is bound to decline and with fast aging. So you refer to these figures about Italy. The trends are driven by two factors. One is low fertility, the fact that Italians do not have many kids. Actually, Italians tend to have more or less a little bit more than one child per couple. It's kind of 1.25. And if one couple has one child, it means that in the long run, without migration, and I will touch upon migration, the population is halving every generation because two people basically have one child. So every generation you get half. And this is why we get this kind of forecast. The second point is migration. Some of these forecasts are based on past trends in migration. And of course, given that there's plenty of people in other parts of the world, everything depends on the trends in becoming an Italian. So these two trends may intersect in this sense. If Italy is doing well, people will decide to have more kids because the world is good to have more kids for the future if they want. We should not force anyone. But also Italy will become attractive, and I'm thinking again only of Italy, for young people all over the world. So what can young people do? You're asking me. I have one answer. One answer is for ambitious Bocconi students. As ambitious Bocconi student, you can gain important positions in business, in government, in international institutions, and try to make sure you have an influence on these trends. If you are in business, you may create, you may influence a company in shaping a good life for their workers, the fact that they can combine work and family, they can have a good work-life balance. You can provide opportunities for young people to think about the long run, not just short-run perspective. If you enter into government, you could shape policies towards helping those who want to have a family, to create a family, to combine work and family, but also maybe to create a welcoming society to a more diverse population and think that migration is not just an evil, but it's something that is a good engine, is good fuel for a society. If you work in international institutions, then it's your challenge to make sure you bridge this national interests that sometimes are against each other to create a world in which we think globally, and the core point of thinking globally is balancing migration trends.
May I also ask you, keeping an eye on these challenges that the youngsters are facing in the next years, what could be the effect of a lack of policies and opportunities to youngsters? And also, given your favorable position as Director of Bocconi University and in our environment of a policymaker, what would be the policy you would suggest to invert these negative trends about youngsters?
I think inclusion is fundamental. So we are discussing today, this kind of exchange is exactly what we need. And then this exchange will allow us to develop some ideas or discuss what are best practices or gold standards that we will want to apply. So, for instance, if we understand that for young people today, some values are fundamental in the business world, in the world of institutions, then we have to discuss that together. You, as young people, have to tell us, the older generation, what are the core values you like to see in our society, and it's our duty, but also your duty as kind of other parts of the policy world to push us to change this. What can we do at Bocconi? At Bocconi, we can do two things. Build a better community. This is not only us, it's also you. It's all of us as a community. Make sure we have inclusion, we value diversity, we value sustainability, we respect each other on a daily basis. So this is number one. And second, to go back to what I have before, is make sure we are ambitious. So we as professors have to transmit to you the value of trying to make a difference. You don't have to be shy in your career desires. You have to aspire to the best possible job in, again, business, in an institution, in politics, because that will make a big change. And there you can make an impact on young people. Maybe it will not be you, but it will be next generation. But being that ambitious will help also the current generation to achieve a better world.
You touched upon a theme that is quite dear to me personally, and I think it's extremely relevant today and maybe has always been very relevant, which is migration. Now, you mentioned the big crises that have been with us over the past few years, let's say from the pandemic. You've mentioned how they've always been there, and from crisis, usually migrations increase. Now, my question is, to what extent does a sustainable future and a future that as the young generation we should aspire to depend on both changing the policies and changing the narrative that surrounds migration to this day, both in Italy and not only Italy, Europe?
Yeah, thank you. This is a fundamental question for our societies, and narratives are central. First of all, migration is the history of this world.
Yeah.
So humans exist as we do today because of migration. There's been massive global migration in the past, and I use mass migration. It has already existed. Otherwise, we won't exist in the way we exist today. So we won't exist without migration. The world will never move to a situation in which migration is low. This is not going to happen. The second point is a narrative point, and I'd like to touch upon words. Within the EU, we value a lot mobility, labor mobility, the idea that we build Erasmus, general free movement of labor. This is not considered migration. Before this job, I was in the UK. I had a job there. And the discussion was a lot about what is the meaning of migration. Do people moving from other EU countries, because then Britain was part of the EU, do they constitute migrants or are they movers? And so narratives are important. Within Europe, we are valuing getting experience somewhere else, and we call it mobility. At the global level, we tend to say migration is a challenge. I think we have to reconcile the two perspectives. Mobility per se is important. For instance, you were mentioning the difficulty of young people, maybe in a place like Italy. Being able to move to another country is an opportunity. It's not only something you can be forced. Of course, if you have no other choices, then it becomes migration in a negative sense. Mobility is always positive. Migration has this kind of challenging perspective. I think we have to see these two faces of the same coin as basically coming together. Migration and mobility are the same thing, just from a different perspective.
You said earlier something I really like, which is that as social scientists, it is our duty to communicate all of these things. Now, my question is, through what channels should this be communicated to a more widespread population, let's say, so that the message gets through not only to us within this community, but also to a wider audience?
Yeah, thank you. This is a question dear to my heart. As a Bocconi social scientist, I have to say we have two kind of big duties. The first is to do frontier research. We have to make sure we produce gold standard knowledge, not only opinions. The second is, once we produce gold standard knowledge, we have to make sure this gold standard knowledge is translated into an opinion for the general public, for policymakers. We should make sure we have both. We cannot just write op-eds on newspapers without having science backing us. So I think we have to do both. We have to be present on the media. We have to be present in debates with policymakers, but always do that based on solid scientific knowledge. I think this is something we too often forget. If you ask me, I'm a demographer, you can ask me something about football or other topics. I have opinions, music, but I'm not an expert, a real expert in these topics. I can tell you something about football, about music. I am an expert in demography, and I think I should be listened more when I speak about my own subject, where I have expertise, than when I speak about football and music, where I have opinions, but I don't have the science.
Going back to the narratives that we were talking about, mobility versus migration, do you think that this divergent narrative might have something to do with what we were saying before about some opposition in the richer parts of the world to tolerating uncertainty to help the rest? Maybe we are really opposed to acknowledging that if we want more equality on a global scale, we have to level the playing field also in this sense, and we cannot consider mobility within the EU as something entirely different from migration elsewhere.
Yeah, I think what globalization brought us in the end with big data, you could say, with the internet, is more awareness of what's happening in other parts of the world. So in the rich part of the world now, it's a bit more difficult than it was in the past to ignore what's going on. We had a touching inauguration of the academic year with a Nobel Prize winner from Congo. He basically told us, look, in Congo, the situation is a disaster. In the past, maybe no one would have noticed that. Now we cannot ignore what's going on. And so this is one point in which we can move with more awareness to a situation in which we will welcome diminishing the uncertainty and shocks in poor parts of the world. On the other hand, the fact that the internet is there allows the poor parts of the world to understand more what is the life of the rich. And I have to say, to be frank, we are in the rich part of the world, in the privileged part of the world. But someone can look at us and aspire to come here. But that's perfectly fine. The core policy challenge we will face is to balance both ideas, both aspirations as well, without undermining the big fabric of the world, but not the big fabric of a specific society. Of course, there are big political challenges, but that's a bit too long to discuss in this answer.
Looking closer to home, you've talked about the importance of Bocconi University being a research university that can generate ideas to train future-proof students. Can you tell us something more about this idea?
Okay, the idea of training future-proof students is to give instruments, ideas, and the ability to read the world. So the instruments sometimes are mathematical instruments, skills like being able to debate and read, logic training, computer programming, this kind of skills that may not directly train you today for what's going on, but will equip you in the future to learn new things. So these are the instruments. Ideas, we have to understand that ethics, diversity, sustainability, these are crucial ideas for the world. Some ideas about what is going on today. This is something where Bocconi has to answer to current students their desire of understanding the future. And the third point is data. So sometimes we have to understand what's going on. We have to understand how the world is organized, what is actually happening. I think this combination of instruments, ideas, and data is something that will help our students to become future-proof.
You have talked about the point of view of the students and the training that they need to get. Now let's take the opposite perspective. Given also that, as you said earlier, our future depends on inequality and sustainability, which are two themes that are particularly dear to our generation. How can the job market adapt to include these themes, and is it already happening?
I start from your last question. It's already happening. There is pressure. Thank you to the young generation. There is pressure on job seekers to create inclusive workplaces where you have a better job and a better work-life balance. So it's already happening, but it's not enough. So how can we do that? I have 2 points. First of all, as students aspiring to get a job, you should always signal that to employers, potential employers. You should go to interviews, you should go to the Bocconian jobs and say, look, I want to work in a place that values diversity, inclusion, where work-life balance is considered. So do that. This is number one. Then you'll have to vote with your feet. If you have to have a choice about two jobs, you have to consider that as an important feature. But then you are Bocconi students. You will become the bosses of the future, as I was discussing today. When you become a boss, always think back to these values, and we hope you retain these values forever.
So, Professor Billari, you think that university is not only the place where to study data to understand how the world works, but also the place where to discuss, where to actually try to understand together how to impactfully impact on the world, basically. So it's a place where people can come together and discuss about the future and actually make a difference in the future.
Yes, when I was thinking about instruments and ideas, I was not necessarily only considering data and reading the data. Some of the instruments are including debate, the ability to agree to disagree, ethics, logic way of thinking. These instruments may allow us to develop ideas, and these ideas may be diverse. We don't need to agree, again, on music and football, but we have to agree, for instance, on tolerance, on valuing diversity. Some of the instruments will help us in developing better ideas. Others will help us in developing new ideas, and these ideas may be also business ideas that do not necessarily need to be agreed upon altogether. But this is something that Bocconi needs to push.
And if I can add a question about Bocconi specifically, how your perspective as a former student is helping you to establish long-term objectives for Bocconi University in this matter of social justice, environment, and equality?
Let's say, as a former student, my first point of view is that I care a lot about Bocconi. So Bocconi has given me lots of opportunities. I came from not a very privileged background. I came here as a student. I could develop a career, and now I'm the rector of Bocconi. It's impossible to me to think back and could I ever imagine getting here? No, frankly speaking, no. Maybe at some point after a while I said, it would be nice to become a professor. And this became a career goal, but never the rector of Bocconi. So I have to say, loving this institution is one of my assets, if anything. And this was one reason why I left my previous employer, the University of Oxford, to come back to Bocconi. How can I contribute in terms of topics? I have to say, I was a Bocconi student. I chose economics. It was called Economia Politica. I chose an economics trajectory that brought me to become a social scientist, broadly speaking. So topics like diversity, inclusion, the study of inequality, data for good, these are exactly my type of scientific topics. So I have to say, I bring this perspective, which is complementary to the economic perspective and the business perspective. But we are all part of this community, and we kind of understand that we can gain from each other knowledge about each of the parts of the world.
So, Professor, do you think that this attachment to the institution represents an added value for social scientists and how they can impact the issues that they care about? Do you think that with respect to a university or other institution where the community is not as close, we really have something more, and even the exchange among professors and students can provide inputs for more impactful and even a greater amount of ideas that can contribute to the world?
I think so. So basically generating new ideas and new solutions to the world challenge comes from the interaction in a community where people care about each other, they care about listening to each other. If Bocconi keeps being the community it is and even more kind of connected, then we can have the aspiration to attack the most important problems of the world, at least from a social science perspective. We don't touch upon all sciences, so we cannot solve all the world problems. We can aspire to solve some of the world problems by working together and generating ideas. It is very important to be committed at the local level, to our local community, to think about solving global level problems.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to all of you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this, and you can read more about some of the big trends and issues that will be impacting 2023 in the next issue of Via Sarfatti 25 magazine. I'm Tommaso Eridani, and I hope you'll join me again soon for another episode of Story Scanner.